For one reason or another, Australia has always been one of, if not my favorite country for metal. From their small but awesome 80s thrash scene to the black and death metal stuff starting in the 90s and basically everything in between. Due to the country's remote location, their bands may not have been the first to do everything, but when they caught up, they did it better than most. I won't be talking about AC/DC and Rose Tattoo, as awesome as they were back in the 70s, but I'll be starting in the early 80s with their speed, thrash, and proto death metal scene before moving on to this country's contribution to the death metal, black metal, and grindcore stuff. And also, I just like to throw this out there if you're an Australian. Sorry about the corny picture of kangaroos. I just really like animals. Tyrus formed in Melbourne in 1984 and are considered one of Australia's earliest thrash metal bands. There were a few others from around that time, but Tyrus beats them to the punch as far as established bands go. Though they started out playing a more traditional metal, their one and only demo from 1986 is straight up thrash metal, sounding like a stripped down Slayer, vicious and brutal. The demo only has 4 songs, but they are all worth your time. Singer and guitarist Peter Hobbs would even use some of these songs for his Hobbs Angel of Death album, which we will get into in a bit. I would recommend tracking down the Rats Will Have Their Feast compilation from 2012, which has the entire 1986 demo, plus a bonus track from 1984 unreleased demo tape. Or you could get the self-titled compilation from 2013 that has the same 5 songs, plus 6 unreleased live tracks, one being a cover of Slayer's Hell Awaits. Along with Hobbs Angel of Death, Slaughterlord are probably the second most important band of the early days of the Australian underground. They were only active for about 3 years. They formed in 85, but they left behind 3 demos, 2 in 86 and 1 in 87. Slaughterlord were blurring the lines between thrash and death and black metal back when there were few metal subgenres, if any. Even across the globe, few bands were putting out music this evil and feral sounding, and they would inspire death and black metal bands that would start appearing a few years later. I wouldn't discover Slaughterlord until At the Gates would cover one of their songs on the 2002 re-release of the Slaughter of the Soul album. They might not be the most extreme-sounding band to you if you were just discovering them, but in 1986 they were absolutely savage. Imagine a cross between early Slayer and the first Bathory album. I'd recommend tracking down the Thrash Till Death compilation from 2000, which has all the demos that they did. Thanks to Invictus Productions for that. I myself only have a bootleg, but it's pretty well done. Despite Tyrus getting most of the early Australian thrash credit, Renegade actually formed in 1982, which was 2 years earlier. They even had a demo in 85, which was their very first. Maybe you could say it's more speed metal than thrash, but genres back then were not obsessed over and defined. Their debut and only album came out in 1987 and was much more brutal and evil sounding than the demo. This thing clocks in at just under half an hour and rips along a fairly fast pace the entire time. Any diehard speed and thrash metal maniac should easily have time for this little gem. Iron Bonehead released it on vinyl back in 2011 with the 85 demo tacked on, so that's probably the best version to get. Mortal Sin are another one of the earliest Australian thrash bands, forming in 1987. Their debut album, Mayhemic Destruction, came out that same year. The band was clearly inspired by Metallica, and metal critics loved this album so much that they were at the time said to be the next Metallica. Setbacks, and I'm sure being in Australia in the 80s didn't help their momentum. That, and I've always had a theory that most thrash bands that released their debut album after, let's say, 86 or 87 were likely to fizzle out since they just didn't have time to gain enough momentum to survive the 90s. Mayhemic Destruction remains one of the most important albums for Australia. Had they lived in the US, they most likely would have had rivaled the output of, let's say, Exodus, Testament, and even Overkill. Hobbs' Angel of Death was started in 1988 by Peter Hobbs after he dissolved Tyrus. Peter is arguably the biggest legend of Australian metal ever. Sadly, he passed away in 2019, but I was fortunate enough to see Hobbs play live and even chat with Peter for a bit, and he was quite the nice fellow. The debut self-titled album was released in 1988, but I believe Peter told me that it was recorded some years earlier, but I could be wrong about that. Peter goes for a grittier vocal tone here than he did with Tyrus. The music is faster, heavier, and more evil sounding than the other Australian thrash bands of the time. If you love Slayer and Possessed, you will love Hobbs' Angel of Death. Now, obviously, Dead Can Dance are not metal, even in the slightest. However, their music is emotional and intense, and many metal fans around the world are massive fans. Dead Can Dance formed in 1981, predating the majority of the Australian metal scene, and their debut EP was released in 1984. I decided to choose their fourth album from 1988, The Serpent's Egg. I could never in a million years be able to describe this album accurately. It's a strong showcase of the level of songwriters that they are, and here you will get elements of folk, world music, ambient music, and maybe new age? I tried. This group is just that of pure magic and otherworldly brilliance. Dead Can Dance is the brainchild of Brendan Perry and Lisa Gerrard. Persecution seemed to be a lightning in a bottle type band, forming in 1989 and releasing an amazing demo that same year, although they had cut their teeth from 1987 to 1989 as No Remorse, with a demo in 88. This 89 demo sees the band heavier and more evil than ever, and while I hear plenty of influence from Megadeth, Metallica, and Slayer, they were clearly paying attention to the burgeoning death metal scene that was about to take over. This is one of the best thrash or death thrash metal demos, whatever you want to call it, ever, and the guys in Bestial War Lesson Destroyer 666 knew about it, but sadly not many others do. I'd recommend tracking down the compilation from 2016, released by Dark Symphonies, since it has the 1989 Persecution demo, along with the 1988 No Remorse demo. Acheron were the precursor to Abramelin, who I will also be talking about at some point. Despite being an earlier version of Abramelin, Acheron had a more raw, unpolished sound. Forming in 1988, that makes him by far one of the earliest Australian death metal bands. Their 1991 EP is not easy to find physically, but is recommended for a good example of what they sounded like between 88 and 94. It's only 2 songs, but you gotta start somewhere. They also have 2 demos, and I have no idea why a compilation has not been made with all their material, which could easily fit on a single CD. Underground death metal labels, please take note. Corpse Molestation formed in 1990 by KK Warslut, Damon Bloodstorm, and a fellow named Brad called BC. Little did they know at the time that they would not only later on be known as a legendary, pioneering band in the black death metal underground, but would splinter off after a few years of activity into Destroyer 666, Bestial Warlust, and Abominator. Corpse Molestation had 4 demos between 1991 and 1993, and they played a particular primitive and nasty brand of black death metal that Australia would soon be forever known for. I'd say they were paying attention to what Blasphemy were doing around that time, but I would never say that they were, Blasphemy clones. They weren't aping Blasphemy's sound necessarily. Corpse Molestation were most known for their 1992 demo, Dissension of a Darker Deity, but I'm going to recommend the 2009 compilation Holocaust Wolves of Apocalypse, released by Necroharmonic Productions, because it pretty much has everything they ever recorded. Disembowelment are a band I should have gotten into much earlier than I did, due to seeing pictures of the band and not thinking that they looked like metalheads, which I admit was kind of stupid, and also seeing the second logo that they would use, which didn't look metal to me either. That was definitely my loss. Although in band photos they look like nice, intelligent fellows, their music was hellish and dungeon-sounding doom death metal, and they would stand out from the pack by interspersing blasting of fast death grind sounding passages into their bleak and slow doom death. This is easily a top 10 of all time doom death albums, and I'll hear no argument against that claim. The atmosphere is bleak and oppressive, and the songwriting is just perfect. They left behind a few demos, an EP, and a full length, and I would recommend getting the 2005 self-titled compilation released by Relapse Records, since it has almost everything the band ever recorded. Misery are what I would consider to be one of the most underrated Australian death metal bands, possibly due to, despite forming in 1991, they didn't record their debut album until 1993, making them just a little late to the game even for Australia. Not being signed to a well-known label also didn't help. They had a similar sound to fellow Australian death metal band Abramelin. They played a beefy, brutal style of death metal full of chugging riffs and brutal breakdowns, mostly playing mid to a faster pace with the occasional slower type passages that were used to great effect. I highly recommend the debut album A Necessary Evil from 1993.
That's right, I'm from Australia as well. So, yeah. Although I have an English father, Australian mother, some English bloke said that makes me Welsh. So I don't know what that fucking means, but like you lot. But English people laugh, so I just keep fucking saying it. So
I can't talk about the Australian underground without mentioning Steve Hughes. Steve is a drummer and founding member of Slaughterlord and Nazgul. He also did stints in Mortal Sin and Sadistic Execution, among others. He still plays music from time to time. In fact, he has a solo project called Eternum, where he performs everything, including the vocals. But he is mostly known these days for his stand-up comedy. I'm a big stand-up fan, and Steve is one of my favorites. To me, he is like the second coming of the late great Bill Hicks. If you want to laugh your ass off, check out Heavy Metal Comedy from 2006 and Big Issues from 2009. Now we will get into the absolute insanity that is Sadistic Execution, another band that are Australian underground metal elite. I always considered them the man of war of black death metal. Everything they did was so over the top. The music is the audio equivalence of insanity, which makes sense given their reputation. They formed in 1985, and their first demo was in 1987. I've always considered them to be a profound influence on the war metal scene due to their barbaric and uncompromising sound. My favorite album has always been and will always be their second album from 1994, We Are Death, Fuck You. Although I couldn't tell you exactly why, it's just always been my go-to album from them. Most of the members went on to release solo albums as well, which are also worth investigating. Bestial Warlust are a top 3 Australian band when it comes to being influential. They formed in 1993 after the demise of Corpse Molestation, in which most of the original members played in. I always considered Bestial Warlust to be the Australian answer to Blasphemy from Canada, and they are every bit as chaotic and punishing. Listening to one of their albums is like being punched in the goddamn face. Both albums are equally good, but I tend to gravitate to the 1994 debut, Vengeance War Till Death. The album plays for 31 minutes, which is good, because you couldn't possibly handle anything longer than that, since it rarely slows down for you to catch your breath. In addition to both albums, I'd also recommend you check out their 1996 live album, Storming Bestial Legions. Abramelin, otherwise known as Acheron from 1988 to 1994, had their debut self titled album out in 1995, and they're now seen as one of the greats in the Australian underground death metal scene. Even with a small discography, that self titled album continues to be celebrated. Armed with that brand of Australian brutality that makes their death metal bands what they are, there's also a lot of the more brutal death metal flavors in their sound. If they were an American band, one would easily assume that they came from the East Coast. And whether or not that is your cup of death metal tea, this album should not be overlooked. It even has a Dead Can Dance cover tacked on at the end that only an Australian band could pull off. It actually reminds me in a way of Alchemist, which is very cool. Anatomy are one of my personal favorites from the land down under. They formed in 1989 as a crucial part of the Australian death metal underground and played pure death metal until at least 94 or 95, but 96 saw them taking more interest in black metal, and their 96 debut full-length album Where Angels Die could be called black death metal, but for me it veers much more into black metal territory and is a personal favorite. Still savage enough for the death metal crowd, but evil enough for the black metal crowd, at least I would think. It also remains distinctly Australian sounding. I hear a little sadistic execution in this album, and there are some keyboards for that 90s symphonic sound that I love, which could have came from some Scandinavian influences, but they aren't heavily utilized. Fans of sadistic execution or even Mystifier from Brazil should definitely take note. In my opinion, no Australian metal list is complete without Nazul. They are incredibly important, and their contributions to black metal history cannot be understated. However, it often is. They formed in 1993, and among their ranks was Steve Hughes of Slaughterlord on drums. They had a great debut album in Totem from 1995, and my personal favorite album of theirs, and one of my favorite black metal albums in general, is Iconoclast from 2009. I decided to instead focus on the Black Seed EP from 1998 today, since it is the perfect bridge between those two albums. Some of the material here is like no black metal I've ever heard, truly otherworldly. Much of that is due to the keyboard work of both Wraith and Lachlan Mitchell creating keyboard passages you have not heard from earlier purveyors of that sound in Norway or Sweden. Some of the songs here are almost completely keyboard driven again, like nothing you've ever heard before, and it will likely leave you spellbound by its power. 4 members here contributed guitars to this EP, including Reverend Chris Hades of Sadistic Execution. Another unique part of the Nazul sound is the vocals, done by Morte here. Heavily use of vocal reverb is always part of the Nazul sound, especially on the earlier material. Usually sounding like no other vocalist in black metal, it is a large part of the Nazul atmosphere. Now, you cannot talk about the roots of underground Australian metal without bringing up Armored Angel. Forming back in 1984, the band had a more traditional speed metal sound. They would then morph into a thrash metal band before evolving into death metal. The string of thrash EPs and demos are considered by many to be the band's best work, but I'm pretty partial to the 1999 Soul full length Angel of the Sixth Order. Since they had already been a band for 15 years, they had plenty of time to hone their craft, mature, and write a death metal masterpiece, which is exactly what they did. This album is now fairly well known thanks to the attention of labels like Headsplit and Hell's Headbangers taking interest and releasing new and old material. Angel of the Sixth Order is one of the more original sounding death metal albums in its own way, and it should not go ignored.